Hi, everyone. This is Dana Lewis, and welcome to another edition of Backstory.
Poviyai no poviyai. That is a proverb in Russia that says, trust, but verify.
If we and the Soviet leaders take the right steps, we can dramatically shrink the arsenal of the world's nuclear weapons.
The United States and Russia have agreed to the most comprehensive arms control agreement in nearly 2 decades.
Echoes of the past, or were those voices of Presidents Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and most recently Barack Obama, merely a pause in our race to world destruction? It's certainly mad, mutually assured destruction between Russia and the United States, averted up until now only because of 2 nuclear treaties called START 1 and START 2. In this backstory, we will speak with a former Undersecretary of Defense in America and one of the key negotiators of START, and they will both tell you unless President Trump renegotiates the treaty set to expire next year, we are at a dangerous precipice that may lead us into the unthinkable, nuclear war. And now the chief negotiator of the Strategic Arms Control Treaty, who says, world, wake up, time may be up. Joining me now is Rose Gottemoeller. Rose, how are you?
I'm well, thank you very much.
I want to read off a little bit of your resume, because I think we all have great experience in our fields. But when I read yours today, read back on it, I have to say it's beyond impressive. And to be able to speak to you on arms control is an amazing opportunity. I mean, I know you from Moscow when I was a news correspondent there, and you were head of the Carnegie Institute. But since then, you were the Deputy Secretary General of NATO. Prior to that, you were Undersecretary of State in 2014. You held the position of Undersecretary for Arms Control, Verification and Compliance from 2009. You were also the Chief Negotiator for the Strategic Arms Control Treaty, the new START Treaty. And there's more. You served on the National Security Council of the White House as Director of Russia and Ukraine and Eurasia. And you've also taught at Georgetown Soviet Military Policy. Wow. Have I left anything out?
Well, there are a few think tanks in there, but I think it's really kind of you, Dana. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
It's great. I think you've had a remarkable career. Do you think, with everything that you've done, that we're edging closer to a nuclear exchange with a nation state like Russia? Are you worried?
I have to say what worries me is it seems like we may be coming to the end of a 50-year cycle in strategic nuclear arms control, because we are coming to the end of the new START treaty. Unless the treaty is extended, it will go out of force in February of 2021. And so it is a concern of mine that we may be at a point where there are no more negotiated constraints on the large US and Russian nuclear arsenals. And that could spell the beginning of a new arms race.
You just wrote an article in the Foreign Affairs magazine, co-authored by the Russian ambassador to Washington, Anatoly Antonov. That's unusual to say the least. How did that come about that you worked together?
Anatoly and I were the chief negotiators of our respective countries for the new START treaty negotiations. So we worked together very intensively for the 2009-2010 period. We started the negotiations in April of 2009 and ended them 1 year later in April of 2010. And throughout that period, we were working very intensively together. He's a crack diplomat, an excellent negotiator, sometimes a very tough nut to crack, but you can imagine we spent a lot of hours together during that year.
But I mean, you probably spend hours together as rivals in a way, each trying to get the best deal for their country.
Absolutely. There's a lot of fisticuffs involved in any nuclear arms negotiation, in any negotiation, and each chief negotiator is trying to get the best deal for his or her country. So that goes without saying. But out of those tough fights comes, I think, a good mutual respect.
So doesn't it say a lot that you, former rivals in your own way, sat down and wrote this piece together saying that START is in trouble?
I think it's been clear from the perspective of the Russian government for some time that they wanted to see the New START treaty extended. And so, even though Anatoly is in very much an official position, nevertheless, he could get the go-ahead to work on this article. From my perspective, clearly I'm out of government at the moment, but I do feel that the New START treaty continues to serve U.S. national security interests. And so that was my motivation for sitting down and writing it with him.
If you don't mind, I'll read a paragraph from it because I was struck by it. The coronavirus pandemic should serve as a powerful reminder of the fragility of the international system. This is exactly the wrong moment to undermine or weaken other key components of that system, especially in the nuclear realm. Extending the New START would demonstrate that the world's powers are capable of working together to reduce shared threats. Letting it go would be a chilling sign of just how dangerous the world has become. Pretty strong stuff.
Indeed, the core of the importance of New START is that it provides predictability about these terrifying strategic nuclear forces of the United States and the Russian Federation that could destroy the world many times over. But with them constrained in a bilateral treaty that both sides are continuing to implement in very clear and firm ways, we have mutual predictability. And under that kind of system, those kinds of worries recede. They are terrifying weapons, but they are kept under some control.
Do you think America will simply extend the treaty as Russia has called on it to do? Because President Trump has called it a bad deal. Why does he do that?
Well, you have to talk to President Trump about that. I can imagine when he remarked on it to begin with, he may not have had a chance to consider all the implications if the treaty goes away. I also do know from what President Trump has said in the past that he is interested in his own nuclear arms reduction deal. And I believe that extension of New START and a new nuclear arms reduction deal with President Trump's name on it can go hand in hand.
But we've never seen these negotiations from partisan politics before, have we? It's never been a Republican deal or a Democrat deal. It's been bipartisan, has it not?
That is the case very much historically. Traditionally, arms control treaties in the Senate gained over 90 Senate votes. It wasn't the case with the New START treaty because bipartisanship is not as strong as it was historically in the United States,
That's for sure.
On Capitol Hill or in the government. But I was proud that nevertheless we were able to gain the Republican votes we needed to get it across the finish line. So I do think that there is still an interest in the treaty on both sides of the aisle. And so I hope that we can nevertheless find a way to drive forward on this issue and also get new deals and get new deals ratified.
Can you explain to somebody who doesn't understand arms control, and most people don't understand how these things actually work? They're just not a bunch of pieces of paper. I mean, trust but verify happens on the ground, and it's so that both sides don't play this cat and mouse game with nuclear arms, launch platforms, and missiles and warheads. What actually happens then?
It took a long time for us to get the Soviets back in the 1970s and 80s, now the Russians, to agree to it. But now we have inspectors on the ground who go into Russian nuclear facilities. They look at their missiles, they look at their submarines and bombers. They make sure that the obligations that the Russians have taken upon themselves in the treaty are actually being carried out.
And why is that important? Why is that important if all of a sudden the Russians start moving around a ballistic warhead or they move a missile onto another mobile launcher? I mean, what can happen if you're not engaged with each other and explaining to one another what you're trying to do in your staging of these fearsome, scary arms?
The more uncertainty there is about what they're doing with their strategic nuclear arms, the more we have to worry, the more we have to do worst case planning, the more we have to even perhaps build up our nuclear forces, which is very, very expensive. We are currently in the course of modernizing our weapon systems, and that's the right decision, but we're replacing them essentially one for one under the constraints that are in the New START treaty. If we have to start building up, that could quickly get very, very expensive at a time when America has other things to spend resources on. So there are a lot of factors that go into what the importance of an arms control treaty is.
You've talked about and written about the dangers of a trust deficit and the need in a pandemic more than ever to resolve START. Can you explain what you meant?
Yes, a trust deficit comes from when you are uncertain about what's going on in their strategic nuclear forces. Now, the Russians have a lot of mobile ICBMs, and they also have a lot of forests where they can hide those mobile ICBMs. When we know exactly how many there are and exactly where they're deployed, and our inspectors can go in and inspect that, check on it, then we end up with a trust developing over time. It's not something you take for granted. You have to have the evidence, you have to have your own people checking on it. So that's when you have the trust to say, okay, I know where those systems are. We know how to target those systems. If heaven forbid we had to target those systems, we understand what's going on day to day in the Russian strategic nuclear arsenal. If that trust goes away, then we really have to start thinking about, well, how are we going to, if we have to, deal with an increase in readiness on the Russian side? What if during a crisis they bring their missiles to a higher level of readiness and we don't know where they are? What is that going to mean? That means we have to think about having a lot more missiles, maybe. We have to think about having a lot more capability. And again, that's an expensive proposition, and I think not where the American public would like to see resources going at the moment.
President Trump is at the very least unpredictable. I don't want to get you into a political commentary, but I mean, what happens the day after that treaty expires in 2021 if he doesn't automatically renew it or extend it?
I want to make it clear that we're not going to fall off a cliff. The treaty has been in place now since 2011. In 2021, it will have been in place for 10 years. And the current levels of the US and Russian nuclear arsenals are set at 700 delivery vehicles and 1,550 warheads. So those numbers will not change overnight. But one thing I think we all need to bear in mind is that the Russians have already pretty well completed the modernization of their own nuclear arsenal, and it's being kept under these limits. The United States is now at a point we're just starting to modernize our nuclear arsenal, and over the next decade, we're going to be doing that very important work. If those limitations have gone away, we are going to be chasing increases on the Russian side, just as we're trying to modernize. And that makes it very, very difficult. It's better to keep a stable basis on their side so then we can modernize our forces and be comfortable that we're getting the value for the big dollars we're putting into that modernization.
I think your article with the Russian ambassador was a courageous wake-up call, and let's hope the White House has read it. Rose Gottemuller, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dana.
And this year, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists moved the doomsday clock forward. It is now 100 seconds to midnight, the closest symbolic point from an apocalypse since 1953. Presidents Trump and Putin, you need to extend START. Andy Weber was the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear, Chemical, and Biological Defense Programs, and he is now a senior fellow at the Council on Strategic Risks. And I first met Andy, and I have to say, Andy, 20 years ago this month, when I was a correspondent for NBC based in Moscow. We actually met in Kazakhstan, the former Soviet Republic, where incredibly Andy's team in the American Threat Reduction Program attached to the Pentagon had not only discovered the largest weaponized anthrax factory in the world, but they were with the agreement of the Kazakh government dismantling, and Andy, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was 7 stories, 2 football fields long facility.
Yes, it was a massive facility designed to produce 300 metric tons of anthrax agent during a mobilization period. It's now just a green field. We completely dismantled that facility.
Ingredients for a Hollywood movie, but all true.
Can't make that stuff up.
That anthrax was loaded into SS-18 missiles aimed in the Cold War at New York and Chicago and Los Angeles and Washington. And what an amazing thing that you helped discover and dismantle it. Now, fast forward to the Obama administration, and you were, I believe, involved in defense plans for the US in the event of a biological attack on America. Does this COVID-19 pandemic strike you as having some parallels, and in what way?
Oh, definitely. There's a huge overlap, and our policy was to embrace the overlap between natural disease outbreaks, pandemics, and a deliberate biological attack, because so many aspects, detection, diagnosis, response, are overlapping. In fact, that's exactly why we created, under the Obama administration, the Global Health Security Agenda, to get the security and defense communities working together with the global health and development communities on this larger challenge of building up public health capacity around the world in order to protect ourselves from any kind of a biological threat.
So, Andy, we should have been ready. Why were we not?
Well, it's hard to get governments to devote adequate resources to preparedness for rare events, even inevitable rare events. It's always easier to just put it off and put it off. And so I was part of a small group inside and outside the US government and allied governments arguing for greater resources to prepare us for this inevitable biological threat. And we often muse that it might take an attack before we'll be able to get the resources and the political will that we need for this. And unfortunately, that's what we're having now. So it was an avoidable catastrophe.
The Trump administration is now saying it came from a lab in Wuhan. Do you think it was an attack?
Oh, no, this definitely was not a biological attack or a biological weapon. The group at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, with funding from Tony Fauci's institute and other governments, had been investigating bat coronaviruses, going to caves in southern China, collecting samples, blood, bringing them back to the laboratory for scientific study. So while it was definitely not deliberately released or being designed for military purposes as a biological weapon, I don't exclude the possibility that one of these scientists became sick by exposure to this very lethal and transmissible, highly contagious coronavirus that we know originated in bats, whether in the laboratory or in the field, going into caves in very high-risk environments, catching bats and taking blood samples from them.
Let's shift from the COVID-19 to nuclear threats. Because at the height of the Cold War, Russia had, and you can set me straight on numbers here, but around 39,000 nuclear weapons.
Yes,
right?
Together, the United States and the Soviet Union had over 70,000 nuclear weapons pointed at each other.
The American peak was in 1965 with 31,149 weapons. I mean, vast arsenals of weapons for what was known as mutually assured destruction. And it was mad, wasn't it?
Yeah, and we've come down significantly since then, but we still have way too many nuclear weapons. And what I worry about is the potential for using these nuclear weapons is higher than at any point since the height of the Cold War.
We had two treaties after the fall of the Soviet Union, START I and START II, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaties, negotiated in the early 90s, which essentially brought us down to, even though you say there's too many, I mean, we've come down to about 1,500 warheads on each side. The motto was trust but verify. What do those treaties do to make sure we don't have a nuclear war?
Well, in particular, the START treaties and the New START treaty that is still in effect, and both sides agree that we're all in compliance with it. It enables on-site inspections, visits to each other's sites, data reporting on a regular basis. It gives us each transparency into our strategic nuclear arsenals that provides predictability and stability to our leaders who oversee our nuclear forces.
How does it make it more predictable?
Because we know from the inspections as well as the frequent data exchanges, every time they move a warhead from a storage site, for example, to an ICBM missile. So it adds a level of information sharing and verifiability that gives us confidence that they're adhering to the treaty limits.
So there's some notice there, is there, so that you don't feel that one side doesn't feel that the other one is suddenly posturing aggressively?
Exactly. These are reciprocal treaties, and they give us both transparency, and that leads to stability on both sides, and that's something that enhances the security of both countries.
The treaties have worked. So why is America allowing START 2 to run out in February of 2021? There are no current negotiations, I think, underway for a new treaty.
Well, that decision has not been made yet. It's still under review, and certainly President Putin has said he's willing, without any conditions, to enact the automatic extension of 5 years from 2021 until 2026. And we should do that. It's time for the Trump administration to stop dithering and just do that. It's not a reward. It's in our hard national security interest to do so.
President Trump has called it a bad deal.
Well, it's not a bad deal. He tends to criticize anything that was associated with the Obama administration. Anything that happened between 2009 and 2016, he defines as bad because President Obama was in power during those years. But this is a treaty that had strong bipartisan support. It was ratified by the U.S. Senate with many Republican votes, and it's in our hard national security interest to maintain it.
And chapters of these negotiations and bits of the agreement go back to President George Bush, President George Bush Sr., Ronald Reagan, Republicans, by the way.
Exactly. And Ronald Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush understood the grave importance of nuclear weapons stability and predictability, and how that served our national security interests.
Other presidents have pulled cruise missiles out of deployment, and yet President Trump will spend billions on cruise missiles that are capable of carrying nuclear warheads. And where can that lead us? What's your concern?
Well, I think that's a terrible mistake. It leads us to a world that we're in now, where both sides are talking about limited use of nuclear weapons, so-called low-yield nuclear weapons, non-strategic nuclear weapons. And this is very dangerous because it weakens the taboo against using nuclear weapons. And there's no such thing, in my view, of a limited nuclear war. Once one side launches a nuclear weapon against the other, there will be an overwhelming nuclear response. And to think that you could control escalation and have only a few of these nuclear weapons launched back and forth, I think is the height of folly.
Do you really think that that's a sober conversation that's taking place? Or is that just saber rattling? I mean, well, it's not sober in any level anyway, as far as I'm concerned. But do people really believe in the administrations? Do you think on the Russian side and the American side that you could have a limited exchange of nuclear weapons?
Yeah, unfortunately, that is embedded in the doctrines now of both countries. It's a reckless doctrine that we need to move away from. And it's not just what we say, but it's the types of weapons we have. And we have too many of these ambiguous dual-purpose weapons that can be either conventional or nuclear, and it's impossible to discriminate if one is flying towards you, whether it even has a nuclear warhead or not. And that could lead to an accidental escalation into nuclear war, a crossing of that taboo, which is why I've been advocating, and the Council on Strategic Risks has been advocating for the last several years, for a new arms control regime that would begin to cap and eliminate these most dangerous types of nuclear weapons to bring more stability and actually to enhance deterrence.
So everything you say makes perfect sense to somebody like me. Why is it seemingly a hard sell? Why hasn't the Trump administration just said, yes, absolutely, especially now in the middle of a pandemic when we've got our heads and resources focused on getting our economy back on its feet and dealing with a pandemic that is ravaging the world? Why wouldn't they immediately just jump and sign on and say, yes, we don't have time for new negotiations on a new nuclear treaty with Russia. Let's just go ahead and extend that treaty by 2 years, 3 years, 5 years.
Well, extending the New START treaty and beginning the hard work on a follow-on treaty is not mutually exclusive. Let's extend the treaty for another 5 years and give us time to negotiate a new, better arms control agreement, perhaps even bring in China and other countries to it. But we can't do that in the 9 months remaining.
What is your fear if the treaty is allowed to run out in 2021?
Well, a lot depends on the electoral process. If Trump does nothing, the treaty won't expire until February 5th. So if Vice President Biden is elected president in November and enters office on the 20th of January, he will have 2 weeks to extend the treaty if nothing has been done to withdraw the United States from that treaty. So while that's not an ideal scenario, let's hope that at least that can happen.
But time is short.
Time is very short. And the Trump team is going to work on trying to develop a new arms control agreement that includes China, and I applaud that. But let's have the stability of the New START treaty extension in the background of that. Our extending New START treaty is not a reward to Russia. It's not a reward to China. It's something that is in our very deep national security interest.
Andy Weber, it's such a privilege to speak to you always. And I think probably you're one of the great unsung heroes in terms of what you've done, in terms of the reducing threats around the world and to America. It's great to talk to you, and thank you.
Well, thank you, Dana, and thank you for bringing attention to these very important but often ignored issues.
That's our backstory, edition number 2. I hope you like it, and follow me wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Dana Lewis.